Hey, Breaking Points, Saagar's Realignment Podcast co-host Marshall here. Every week, along with the interviews I'm now doing for Breaking Points, Saagar and I are going to post a clip from the Realignment Podcast. Today's is a clip from our interview with Christian Brose. It's a part of our daily Ukraine series. So if you're interested in Ukraine and what's happening from a bunch of different angles, go below, check out our channel, hit subscribe, and also you can find us wherever you find your podcasts. Hope you enjoy the clip.
I guess one thing I'm curious is how do we balance both the need for so for example, like I went to the Georgetown security studies program. I spent a lot of time with some of the people who were thinking about this on a conceptual level, and everything was the future of warfare. You're not even going to recognize it. It's going to be cyber. It's going to be technology. And then a war actually broke out in Europe, and it looks extraordinarily conventional, Chris. And actually, I was just reading the losses are conventional. The equipment seems very conventional. All of the, predictions of precision warfare and all that. Yeah, I mean, we've had cruise missiles, though, for a long time. It doesn't seem all of that next generation. So then in terms of, first of all, can you just respond to kind of what that means relative to our discourse and the way that the future of war that was sold to us, and then what war actually is, and then what that means also for the likelihood of, if the U.S. is to get into a conflict, is it going to look like a Vietnam, like in Iraq and in Afghanistan, or is that prophecy of, Saagar, you don't even understand the high-tech warfare that is to come? Is that actually going to happen this time? Because I'm just a little bit skeptical right now.
Yeah, no, so it's a great point. It's a great observation. And I guess my put on it would be, this is the world of 2022. I think the challenge for all of us is thinking through, and oh, by the way, like none of this just started in January, right? I mean, this is a continuum that we're on, has been playing out for a while, will continue to play out. So I think the question is sort of, where are we on that continuum and where are we going? Mm-hmm. So if I were to step back and sort of speak in historical analogies, right? When we talk about the onset of World War I, 1914, and sort of all of what people looked at the time as this sort of transformation of warfare in terms of precision artillery, machine guns, aircraft, those kinds of next generation capabilities. All of those were visible in some form or another, dating all the way back in some form to the American Civil War.
Yeah, that's right.
And then running through the conflicts of Europe, wars of German unification, the Boer War, those kinds of conflicts where you saw versions of this playing out. And then all of a sudden we saw it in high relief in August of 1914, and the years that followed. I would say sort of similarly, if we kind of look back, there's a lot of what has been visible in Ukraine that has been visible in Ukraine, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen and Saudi Arabia, in Georgia in 2008, and it's this sort of continuum that we're on. And then you kind of think about, well, where are we going in that respect? But to kind of focus it on the here and now, I think the things to call out that are concerning or should be concerning for us, right, is how challenging it is to evade detection, right? The Russians are trying to move in, and they are viewed at all times by, people with sensors on their bodies posting to social media, overhead imagery, commercial satellite, all of this, kind of means, to say nothing of the just actual military sensors that the Ukrainians have deployed, UAS and other things, makes it very difficult to hide. And then you couple that with, increasingly precise means of, fires and effects, low cost weapons. Once found, it becomes very difficult to survive. And then when you sort of think about, well, where are we going in that regard, where you take, the proliferation of sensors, the proliferation of fires, and the ability to network them together, and automate and accelerate, that sort of kill chain process, from finding to fixing, targeting, tracking, engaging, acting, through things like artificial intelligence, machine learning. The challenge begins to scale very quickly, right? In terms of the number of systems that are on the battlefield, the speed with which it enables human decision-making, or in some cases, machine decision-making, and just the volume of it becomes very overwhelming. So, I think where we are in a snapshot of time is that, you can see the continuum, right? You can see reflections of Nagorno-Karabakh last year in what Russia and Ukraine are engaged in this year. You can see
Chris, could you contextualize that for a second?
Yeah, sorry, apologies. So, last year, Armenia and Azerbaijan got into a conflict. I won't explain the origins of it. But what you saw was, one side, the Azeris using, low-cost unmanned aerial systems for target identification, target tracking, linked to very precise weaponry, whether it's rocket artillery or missiles being fired from drones, other kind of means. And what that just, enabled them to do was wreak havoc on Armenian forces because they just couldn't hide. And once they were found, they had a very limited of time to get out of the way before they were struck. And it just became, a very challenging situation operationally for them to contend with because of the way that the Azeris had brought, kind of low-cost technology, unmanned technology, kind of AI-enabled weapons and things of that sort to bear, to just rapidly accelerate the means by which they could find and act against Armenian forces. And I think you're seeing a version of that now in Ukraine. And I would say that it's sort of nothing like where I think this trend is going to go in the future. So, to come back to your question, yeah, I don't think we're anywhere close to what these technologies and how people will start thinking about employing them operationally is going to deliver us in terms of future warfare. But I think, God forbid, if you sort of, if future warfare breaks out in 2025 or 2028 or 2033, we'll look back and see this continuum of events that makes sense in retrospect in the same way that it did in the aftermath of World War I. And I think the challenge for us now is to learn the lessons of where all of these technologies, admittedly in their infancy, are being fielded and used now, so that we can get ahead of this problem and not find ourselves, sort of quote unquote surprised, the way that many perhaps might have been surprised in 1914 if they otherwise hadn't been paying attention.
And I want to zoom in on an idea that is undergirding your talk, especially when you're comparing the Civil War to the Franco-Prussian War, the Boer War, and then World War I, because you made this point at the start of the episode that there could be an advantage to the defense. And if you're looking at previous wars, miscalculating where that goes is a huge problem. So, for example, running into World War I, the popular perception was offense had the advantage when actually, during the style of warfare it turned into entrenched warfare, the defense with machine guns, all sorts of tactics actually had the offensive, as you spent 3 years just throwing millions and millions of people away under that idea. So can you just speak to this actual need to understand whether offense or defense has an advantage and why specifically in this case, defense this doesn't mean you're always going to win. The Germans lost World War I eventually, but what are the factors that play into the current and future battlefield when we're making this calculation?
Yeah. So I would first of all, again, start out by saying, intelligent and informed and experienced people are going to disagree on this, right? I mean, there's arguments on both sides. And the other thing I would say to preface it is that it's constantly changing, right? So I think the lesson of 1914 to 1918 was fires had developed to such an extent in terms of volume and precision of, machine guns, artillery, things like that. But tactics in terms of maneuver were largely unchanged from Greco-Roman times. It was dudes walking across the ground. And in a volley of machine gun fire, that's a really bad place to be. Defense is going to win every time. And literally they had to go underground to survive. So fast forward 20 years later, and now you have, in 1920s, 1930s, innovations in cars, mechanized vehicles, armor, and all of a sudden, tanks, which, had been sort of an interesting idea, have now become a centerpiece of warfare. The Germans are able to integrate this together with airplanes, which have also become a real thing, and fires and communications. And then you have blitzkrieg. And being the defender sitting in a trench is a really bad place to be when you're being run over by this offensive juggernaut. So, to answer your question, it comes back to the, sort of age-old military kind of doctrine of, shoot, move, communicate. And, how the offense or the defense is going to end up advantaged or disadvantaged comes down to the balance of shooting, maneuvering, and communicating. And technology drives all of those things, right? The ability to maneuver, the ability to fire, the ability to communicate, access to information. And as those technologies are blended together, brought together, you end up having advantages, right? So in 1914, maneuver was largely unchanged, over the history of warfare, right? It's like horses and people. 20 years later, you now have a completely different means of maneuvering that creates an advantage for the offense. So as I look at the situation today, I think the sort of trend of technology that we've been engaged in now for decades has to do with proliferation of sensors, proliferation of lower cost precision strike warfare, missiles, fires, weapons, which has created, kind of a variation of what we saw in 1914, where it becomes harder, not impossible, but harder to project power when, the means of being detected, the means of then being, struck once found, are lower cost. The barriers of entry are lower. The volumes of capability that can be fielded are much higher. So, I think that's kind of where we are on this continuum. So I would still say net, the defender has an advantage, right? We talk about the sort of Taiwan scenario as, increasingly hopeless. And like, I'm not here to say that it's like, like a rosy situation, but 100 plus miles of open water to an amphibious landing, in the teeth of the right kind of military capabilities, that's a nasty problem, right? I mean, the only thing harder than defending against an amphibious invasion is engaging in one. Mm-hmm. The right kinds of choices really would advantage the defender here, but technology doesn't stop, and it's entirely possible, right, that in a few years, 5 years, 10, 15, whatever years, you've now kind of flipped this equation once again on its head to an advantage where the offense really has, an ability to move, shoot, and communicate, and put this all together in a way that is very difficult to defend against.
And what I will say to that amphibious point, I think this is a takeaway we can make. Paratroopers, now that this is the tactic they would use, paratroopers are not looking particularly great as a tactic in the Ukraine conflict right now. So,
yeah, and I mean, I think if our strategy rests on the ability to fly, kind of totally observable aircraft very close to an objective and like drop a bunch of people and equipment, onto the X, odds are that aircraft's probably not going to get too close to where it needs to go. These are the kinds of challenges that I think you see the Russians contending with, and there's a lot of other factors that explain why they haven't done as well as some had predicted. But I think at a higher level, this is one of them.